use 3 phases for retraining the shoulder or rehabbing the shoulder, and this is what we call a diagnosis inclusive approach. So what that means is, it's a term from Sue Falsoni. What that means is, regardless of what injury they've had or are coming back from, there's a certain category of exercise that they'll always get, because there are certain things that we always see, regardless of whether they had bursitis, rotator cuff tear, a dislocation, a subluxation, regardless of the specific diagnosis. There's categories of exercises that they're going to need to do in the retraining, rehabbing phase, because they lose control of the scapulae. So oftentimes when you've had an injury, so either you've had an injury and you've got difficulty with retraining the scapula, or that's what led to the injury. Regardless, there's going to be a need to regain scapular control, so control of scapular motion. So in my first phase of rehabilitation for the shoulder, I use a lot of open kinetic chain, so arms free to move. In the first phase of rehab, I use a lot of open kinetic chain scapular stuff, where we focus not on muscles, but we focus on movement of the scapulae, beginning with often retraction and depression. So 2 of the movements that are major in scapular control. Now, again, I say this is diagnosis inclusive, meaning it's regardless of the specific diagnosis, but I want to mention that it's important for you to work in collaboration with other health practitioners that have been involved in the care of your client, because in certain instances of shoulder injury, open kinetic chain exercises can be a little bit contraindicated, or they can be a little bit more problematic in the case of rotator cuff, in certain cases of rotator cuff injury, because what happens in open kinetic chain is that there's a lot more translation of the humeral head, right? So you have to work in collaboration with your healthcare provider. However, that being said, and we won't go into specifics or exceptions, but typically in my first phase, the person is coming back from their rehab, so they've recovered from whatever injury they had, or sometimes they just have shoulder dysfunction. They haven't had a specific injury. They've just got difficulty with accessing overhead movement or things like that. So in the first phase, a lot of open kinetic chain stuff, scapular retraction, depression. The second phase is what I kind of call it would be comparable to the intensification phase. This is where they start to incorporate closed chain kinetic exercises, still focusing on scapular movement. So they'll start doing stuff with the hands up against the wall, and start doing scapular motions with hands against the wall, pushing themselves away. So all kinds of scapular movement against the wall. So introducing closed kinetic chain, where now it's a different control that's required, and there's less translation of the humeral head. In the third phase, really the equivalent of the realization phase, that's when we'll start to integrate pushing and pulling. So once they've gotten through phase 1, which typically lasts anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the frequency at which they're doing the corrective exercises that you're giving them. So after they've done phase 1 and phase 2, and they get to phase 3, that's when they start to incorporate pushing and pulling, again with progressions. So push-ups, hands against the wall, and typically pushing is more difficult than pulling for most people, more difficult to reintegrate, more difficult to control. So I focus a lot more on pushing exercises than pulling exercise in the third phase. If you want to know more about the 3 phases of shoulder rehabilitation, retraining the shoulder, check out my article on Thibarmy.com. I've written an article about it. Go check it out. There's a little bit more detail in there, how to properly retrain the shoulder in 3 phases.